Hello and welcome. The person I am now finds it difficult to recognize the person I once was. That's how British Muslim Ed Husain describes his life with Islamic extremists. He reflects on a life that he says put him together with the types of groups who carried out the attacks of 7/7 in the UK 2 years ago, in which more than 50 people were killed and 700 injured. The attacks exposed radical elements and homegrown terror and changed the lives of Muslims in the UK forever. In his book, The Islamist, Ed Husain documents his journey into fundamental Islam and what he calls back to real life. It's a story that has also made him one of the most controversial Muslim writers around. The critique is mixed. Some call him a brave Muslim, giving insight into the mind of young fundamentalists. Others call his book dated and misleading, saying he reinforces stereotypes and provides no new answers or fresh information. So what purpose do you think such a book and story serves in helping to understand Islam? Now don't forget, we take your questions via phone and mobile text. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Well, Ed Husain is joining me now live from London. So Ed, I want to welcome you to the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Riz.
Thank you. Let me start by asking you, did you feel you were taking any risks in writing this book? Was there any risk of backlash?
There was a risk, yes, but I felt personally responsible for having to write this book because, you know, as a Muslim, you're compelled to speak the truth even if it's against your own self, and that's how I start the book by way of introduction. But also as someone who was involved in extremist activities throughout the 1990s, I very quickly recognized the discourse that led to 7/7. So when I heard Mohammed Siddiq Khan, for example, say, "You're at war with my people," and talk about a them and us mentality and religion-based separatism and confronting the West and creating a global Islamist state, I recognized that because I was part of that very mindset myself. So I felt a responsibility as a human being as well to stand up and to challenge the extremists in our midst. And so yes, there is an element of risk, but if people like myself and others stay silent, I think extremists continue to grow in numbers and strength, and therefore it's as I say, a responsibility to stand up and try to reclaim, to the best of our ability, our religious tradition of 1400 years of spirituality, humanity, compassion and mercy.
Well, Ed, you know, we had a lot of response from viewers, and they sent us emails with questions for you, and I want to put one of them to you. It came from Nouakchott in Mauritania, and Safia Amar writes saying, how would you explain your choice of the word Islamist, a highly controversial term, over the word world Muslim or a more fundamental one? What connotations did you choose to put in your reader's mind?
That's a good question. What I've tried to do is to avoid the typical sort of references to Muslim extremist, Islamic fundamentalist. I've tried to take out the word Islamic out of it and insert Islamism. And that's not just derogatory, as some Western commentators have said, but it's actually how Islamists refer to themselves. So if you read their literature in the Arab world, they quite readily talk about Islamiyya, or talking to themselves as Islamiyin or Islamiyun, as opposed to being Muslimin or Muslimun or just Muslim. So they themselves draw this distinction. But I talk about it in a deeper sense, that this is a new phenomenon going back to the 1950s, post-colonial Middle East, influenced by people like Maududi, Qutb, Nabhani and others, who basically broke with traditional Islam going back 1400 years, and they set up a confrontational ideology rejecting Muslim teachings, as well as rejecting and confronting the West and trying to set up a political entity in the name of Islam. So they've in the last sort of 60 years hijacked our faith, and it's time for us to recognize that what they're promoting as Islam isn't actually Islam, but Islamism, a political ideology by their own reckoning. And they say, I mean, it's their slogan, La Sharqiyya, La Gharbiyya, Islamiyya, Islamiyya, no East, no West, Islamism, Islamism. So it's something that they've put out, and I've tried to challenge in that, I mean, why do you talk about Islamism? Why not Islam? So it's something that I've taken from them and tried to expose for the wider British and global public.
Interestingly, you write in your book, in the preface, you write, you explain why you wrote your story, and you say, the book is a protest against political Islam based on my experience as a British Muslim who grew up in London, became an extremist, an Islamist, and saw the error of his ways. Now, when you write that, when you say how many do see the error of their ways? How many young Muslims are drawn to sort of any kind of extremism, fundamentalism, then suddenly realize, well, wait a minute, this isn't the right way?
Riz, that's an excellent question, and that's really the issue of our times, in that it's vital for us not to just say we'll lock them up for 90 days or 56 days or 30 days as the debate is here in Britain at the moment, but to recognize that these people who are inside these organizations are also human beings. I changed, and I believe that human beings have the potential to change if exposed to legitimate discourse, proper traditional Muslim scholarship. That changed my mind, and I believe that if these extremists, who by definition don't recognize that they're extreme, but the Prophet Muhammad warned us about ghulu, which is a form of extremism in religion, so it's a recognized discourse going back to the Prophet's time that there is such a thing as extremism. When I was an extremist, when people said I was extreme, I never believed it. Those who are in those organizations now don't admit to being extreme, but by the Prophet Muhammad's own recognition and own advice, there is such a thing as extremism. And it's something that we've got to alert people to, and the good news is that there are now large numbers of Muslims beginning to question what it is, how is it that they're different from ordinary Muslims. And I'm pleased to say that since the books come out, I've been in touch with key figures in several of these Islamist organizations who are in discussion, who do want to leave. But the question is, how do we get them out and get them to enter mainstream society without any sort of blame from mainstream society on them?
Now, Ed, there was an email that came in from Massachusetts, from Boston in the USA, and Stephen Bocchetti wrote in saying, I would hope that an extremist in any cause who comes down to earth and finds another way has a story to tell, and a valuable one for men who might follow a similar path. And I wonder how you now, having been on the inside, having understood the mindset of fundamentalist extremists, how you would persuade them they have to change their ways or take another path.
I can only talk about my own personal experiences, and based on that, I started to wake up when I recognized that my extremism, or my sense of false religiosity, was at total odds, first and foremost, with my own parents. And 9 out of 10 cases with extremists in these organizations, they have an odd relationship with their parents. You've got to ask yourself, if you're a Muslim and you think you're serving God and His Prophet, then the Prophet repeatedly said that paradise lies under the feet of your mother. If you're at odds with your mother, which most extremists are, then ask yourself, which Islam is it you're following? Why is it that your Islam is at odds not only with your parents but with fellow Muslims? Then ask yourself, why is it that if you're supposed to be on God's path, why is it that the most of God's creation are condemning you as extremists and there's something wrong with your belief? And then I think it's the most important part is to actually turn to genuine orthodox Muslim scholarship. My opening came about when I met people like Imam Hamza Yusuf Hassan, people from the Arab world such as Habib Ali al-Jifri hafidhahumullah, people like that who have a genuine relationship with God. You see them in the early hours of the morning turning to God, and you recognize, well, my empty, bankrupt ideology has made me an awful human being. And I look to these people who are connected to the Prophet that I claim to work for, and I see in them a light, I see in them a commitment to Islam, a commitment to humanity, a commitment to God. And I think it's exposure to people of that caliber who have an established tradition going right back to the Prophet that allows for extremists to recognize that somehow they were sold a pup. And you know, there's nothing wrong with leaving those organizations and coming on board the mainstream Muslim caravan.
Well, you know, Ed, we have Hassan on the line from the UK with a question. Hassan, what would you like to ask? Go ahead, Hassan.
Hello.
Hi, go on.
Yes, I have a question. My question is, I've read your book, Ed Husain, and you allude in your book and you try to make some type of link between the so-called Wahhabis and terrorists. Whereas in an interview with Riz Khan on Jazeera on the 13th of June, Hamza Yusuf was asked the same question. And he responded, he said, I have to be fair that this is a blanket attack on the Wahhabis as being the source of all evil in the world, and he doesn't buy it. And he mentioned that Ibn Baz had spoken out against and condemned terrorism in all forms, suicide bombings in Palestine and anywhere in the world. So how would you, for example, comment on your words in the book as opposed to the words of Hamza Yusuf, who you recognize as being more educated than yourself? That's my question.
Thanks, Hassan.
Sheikh Hamza is absolutely right. I'm in no position to contradict Sheikh Hamza. However, it's worth noting the historical trajectory of Wahhabism. I've lived in Saudi Arabia for over 7 months. I've seen what they've done to our Haramain al-Sharifain in Mecca and Medina, the total destruction of Islamic heritage sites, the breakdown of the Prophet Muhammad's birthplace, the destruction of shrines that we had valued for over 1,000 years, the clamping down of Sufi Muslims, of Shia Muslims in Mecca and Medina. There are blunders, the blunders have been made, but as Sheikh Hamza said, in fairness, large numbers of Saudi Wahhabi scholars have stood out and condemned suicide bombings, but at the same time mistakes have been made, and in that spirit of fairness we must sort of say to our fellow Muslims in Saudi Arabia, that you've been responsible for creating a discourse of intolerance. Don't forget that when the Wahhabi movement started off in Najd in the 17th century, they started off by destroying a shrine of a companion of the Prophet, as well as going out to Karbala and killing, and Taif, and then Medina and Mecca, and killing thousands of people who were ashraf, members of the Prophet's family, as well as the ulama. So it's a movement that started off on the basis of violence and rejection of the mainstream, and today there's been some moderation, and that should be welcomed. But as Sheikh Hamza said, it's about being balanced and recognized that in recent years there has been some progress, but at the same time, where does Al-Qaeda come from? I mean, which sort of theology does Bin Laden adhere to? It's Wahhabism.
Now, Ed, we're going to have, of course, we'll have people who will disagree with what you say, but we have Basim on the line in the UK who wants to ask a question. Go ahead, Basim.
Hi, Riz.
Hi.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, Basim.
My question to the author of the book is, has he tried to make a distinction between Islam and other blanket names that Islam is being called? Because really in the Muslim world, ask any Muslim scholar, there's nothing called extremist Islam. That does not exist in the world of Islam, no matter what you call it. Islam is one, and it's not an extremist religion.
Okay.
But has he tried to make that distinction? And then he mentioned some scholars in his book, like Sayyid Qutb. Now, Sayyid Qutb is one of the greatest scholars that the Muslim world has seen. And in criticizing such a great scholar, has he really read his book?
Well,
Because Sayyid
Basim?
Qutb is not an extremist scholar.
Okay.
Sayyid Qutb did not break away from mainstream Islam. Sayyid Qutb was just one of the greatest scholars in the 20th
Basim,
century.
let's get Ed, a quick response from Ed on this.
Sayyid Qutb, you know, Allah forgive him, wasn't a Muslim scholar. He was a literary critic. He wasn't authorized by anybody to write tafsir. It's amazing that people think this man was a scholar. He condemned Muslim scholars of the highest caliber. He unleashed a beast known as Islamism. He talked about politics and political parties as vanguard movements. He was influenced by Leninism. I mean, all of this is historically documented. The vast majority of the ulama of Azhar have rejected Sayyid Qutb's teachings. People such as Bin Laden and others are inspired by his teachings. His teachings have led to, I mean, the last point, Riz, if I may, is that the people who opposed people like Sayyid Qutb most have been people like Hudaybi, who was the Amir of Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and his book, you know, Du'a la Qudat. And it's a long and detailed discussion, but Sayyid Qutb, with all respect, wasn't a Muslim scholar. He wasn't authorized with a traditional ijazah system to write what he wrote.
Well, let's get to your book, Ed, and just a quote from that I want to, where you talk about, you know, sometimes a superior feeling among Muslims, and you know, you write that we were Muslim, superior and different from others. Muslims who advocated interfaith dialogue and coexistence were condemned as having a defeated mind. So let me ask how you get past that mindset. How do you convince Muslims to have an open debate?
By taking them right back to how this faith started off. I mean, one of the things that I learned from the Muslim scholars, the genuine Muslim scholars I met in the Middle East while I was staying there, that people like Imam Abu Hanifa, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani in Baghdad had open discussions and debates with atheists. And this whole thing about having a superior mindset, I mean, in the Quran, Allah talks about وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that we've ennobled humanity, the children of Adam. And it's really, I mean, it's explaining Islam in its authentic, traditional way as our forefathers understood it, and that's the best antidote to extremism. It takes time, it doesn't come about easily, but once there are sort of open hearts and open ears to listening, I think mainstream Muslims have a much stronger argument based on a 1400-year track record, as opposed to this new Islamism of the last 60 years.
We have an interesting email that came from Hamilton in New Zealand from Zelina, and you know, she just asked straightforwardly, can a one-time jihadi ever turn against extremism?
Well, it's happening. You should never write off human beings and the potential for humans to change. In recent weeks, I've seen several Muslims of an extremist mindset coming on board the mainstream Muslim caravan. It can happen, and it must happen.
Well, let's look at in your book, when you talk about British Muslims and British Islam, it seems that Britain is taking a very different, or British Muslims are taking a very different path from American Muslims in some ways. You quote, the direction we take at this critical juncture will determine the type of Islam we bequeath to the future generations. The future of Islam is being shaped now. So where do you see it heading, Ed?
It's difficult to tell, but the current signs are twofold. On the one hand, we've got 2,000 plus cases being monitored by the security services here in Britain. That's a phenomenal number of Muslims or Islamists who are being monitored for potential terrorist activity. So that's the bad news. The good news is that with the engagement of government here, as well as mainstream Muslims and community leaders, there's been activities such as the Radical Middle Way Roadshow, where we've had some of the finest scholars from the Muslim world come and attend and invite and engage with Muslims at grassroots level. They, I think, are re-injecting a spirit of love and humanity and compassion to young Muslims. That's a good sign. Thousands of young Muslims are coming back from their studies in the Middle East, particularly Syria and so on. That's also a good sign. And the fact that there are extremists who are now turning against extremism and coming on board the mainstream Muslim caravan is also a good sign. So the signs are mixed, and we can only pray and hope and be optimistic that in 20, 25 years' time, we have a British Islam that's compassionate, humane, forward-looking, and merciful.
A quick question just to end with, Ed. Have you had any feedback from people saying that, you know, they read your book and it suddenly made them think that their way was wrong, that they also took the same path as you?
I've had 4 people come to me with that conclusion from Islamist organizations, and 3 of them were great leaders of those organizations. So there's every hope that, I don't want to take too much credit, but there's hope that, you know, a new debate, a new discourse, a new discussion has opened up, and one remains hopeful.
Well, Ed Husain, I thank you very much for joining us from London.
My pleasure, Riz. Thank you.
Ed Husain there, his book is The Islamist. Well, thank you for being with us. On Monday we speak with US Marine Jamal Badani about life for Arab Americans in the world's most powerful military. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about that or other pressing issues around the world, just send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk's coming up next.